I remember the silence first. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of it, thick and deliberate, settling between our beds like something alive. The dorm room held its breath in that way small spaces do after midnight, when the world outside has finished its daily performance and retreated into shadows. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling that had become as familiar as my own skin. 18 years old and already an expert at sleeplessness, at the particular weight of darkness that presses against your chest when you are too aware of being alone. Across the narrow space that divided our lives, I could hear Elias breathing. Not the deep, even rhythm of sleep, but something restless, unsettled. The mattress springs creaked as he turned over. Once, then again. I kept my eyes fixed upward, tracing the hairline crack that ran from the corner near the window to somewhere above my pillow. A flaw in the foundation that somehow made the room feel more real, more honest about what it was, a temporary shelter for temporary people. Then he spoke, and his voice cut through the quiet like a confession he had been holding back for hours, maybe weeks. He said he missed falling asleep next to someone. The words came soft and low, directed toward his pillow, but meant for the darkness between us, meant for me to carry whether I wanted to or not. I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition that moved through me like cold water. Because those words, they lived inside me too. They had been living there, unnamed and unspoken, curled up in the hollow space beneath my ribs where loneliness makes its home. I had felt that same ache every night, listening to him breathe across the room, wondering what it would be like to not sleep alone, to not wake up reaching for warmth that was never there. But I said nothing. I let the silence take his words and hold them, let them hang in the air like smoke from a cigarette no one admits to smoking. Because what could I say that would not reveal too much, that would not crack open the careful distance we had built between friendship and something else, something that had no name and no safe place to exist? The radiator clicked and hummed against the wall. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches of trees I could not see, making sounds like whispered conversations in a language I almost understood. I counted my heartbeats, tried to slow them down, tried to convince my body that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. In the space of those few words, the geography of our room had shifted. The invisible line that ran down the center, dividing his space from mine, had become permeable. I could feel him thinking, could almost hear the weight of what he had admitted settling into his bones. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time moved differently in that space between confession and consequence, between hearing something true and deciding what to do with it. I thought he had fallen asleep when the soft rustle of sheets told me otherwise. I heard his feet touch the cold linoleum floor, heard the whisper of cotton as he stood and moved across the narrow distance that might as well have been an ocean. I kept my eyes closed, but I could feel him there, hesitating at the edge of my bed like someone standing at the shore, gathering courage to dive into water that might be deeper than expected. The mattress dipped as he climbed in beside me, slowly, carefully, as if he were handling something precious and breakable. He settled against the pillow, and suddenly the bed that had always been too small for just me became exactly the right size for two. Nothing happened. That is what I would have said if anyone had asked, if there had been anyone to ask. Nothing happened except the impossible intimacy of another person's warmth seeping through the thin barrier of our clothes. Nothing happened except the sound of his breathing so close to my ear that I could feel the whisper of it against my skin. Nothing happened except the slow, terrifying realization that my loneliness was not shapeless after all. It had a name and a voice, and it was lying beside me in the dark, close enough to touch but still impossibly far away. Close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his shampoo on the pillow we suddenly shared, could feel the steady rhythm of his heart through the mattress springs. I lay there, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile thing had formed between us in the space of a few whispered words and one small act of courage. Afraid to breathe too deeply and wake up from what felt like a dream I had been having without knowing it. But I was awake. We both were. And in the morning, we would have to decide what to do with this new thing we had created, this quiet revolution that had happened in the dark while the rest of the world was sleeping. The morning after, sunlight crept through blinds that never quite closed properly. I woke alone. Elias had slipped back to his own bed before dawn, leaving only the faint depression in my pillow and lingering warmth. Neither of us spoke of it. We moved through our morning routines with careful politeness, though something had shifted in the air between us. I was 18 then, a first-year literature student who had learned that the safest way to move through the world was quietly. I took the longer paths to class, the ones that wound around campus edges where fewer people gathered. I had perfected the art of disappearing into routines that required no explanation. My days began before sunrise, walking to the all-night cafe where I could sit alone with coffee and assigned reading. I preferred these early hours when the world felt unfinished, when I could pretend I was the only person who existed. The barista knew my order but not my name, which felt like exactly the right amount of human connection. I spent mornings in the farthest corner of the library, where dusty poetry volumes gathered shadows and silence. Here I could read without interruption, letting words of dead poets wash over me like water over stones, smoothing away sharp edges of whatever I was trying not to feel. My phone rang at precisely 2 o'clock each Tuesday and Thursday. Home calling, reliable as sunrise. My mother's voice, bright with pride that parents carry for children who have exceeded expectations. She would tell me about weather, about my father's job, about neighbors I barely remembered. I would tell her about classes, about professors impressed with my essays, about the bright future everyone assumed I was building. What I did not tell her was how foreign that future felt, how much it seemed to belong to someone else. My parents had grown up in a small Midwestern town where everyone knew everyone, where life followed patterns laid down by generations before. They were proud I was studying literature, proud I called home regularly. But beneath their pride lived an unspoken expectation that I would finish my degree and come home to something familiar, something safe. Find a nice girl, settle down, give them grandchildren in the same small rooms where I had learned to dream of escape. My roommate was everything I was not. Elias moved through the world like he belonged in it, like every room had been waiting specifically for him. He had easy charm that made professors remember his name and classmates save seats at lunch. When he laughed, which was often, it sounded like music you wanted to hear again. He studied music with casual confidence, his side of the room organized chaos. Sheet music scattered across his desk, clothes draped over chairs, guitar leaning against the wall like an old friend. He belonged in photographs, had the kind of face cameras loved, the kind of smile that suggested he knew secrets worth keeping. Our room was small, 2 narrow beds against opposite walls and a window overlooking the courtyard where students gathered to smoke. We had been assigned randomly, 2 names pulled from a database without consideration for compatibility or consequence. In the beginning, we maintained the invisible boundary running down the center. His belongings on his side, mine on mine. We made small talk about classes and weather and cafeteria food that tasted like disappointment. But slowly, imperceptibly, our worlds began to blur. It started with small things. A coffee mug left on my desk. A borrowed book, Kerouac, which he never finished but kept anyway. Pages marked with notes that said, "This is beautiful," and "I don't understand but I love it," my phone charger in his outlet because it had stopped working. I noticed the scent of his cologne woven into my pillowcase after he fell asleep on my bed during study sessions. I would lie awake later, breathing in that faint trace of something warm and clean and distinctly him, wondering when I had started paying attention. He stole my hoodies, claiming they were more comfortable than his own. I would find them returned smelling like his skin, like soap and sleep, and something indefinable that made my chest tighten in ways I was not ready to examine. There were late-night conversations that stretched until dawn, whispered exchanges about childhood fears and college anxieties, and the strange loneliness that followed us despite being surrounded by thousands of other students. We developed a language of glances and half-finished sentences, of comfortable silences that felt more intimate than words. I found myself taking different paths to class, ones that might cross with his. I started drinking the tea he liked, keeping extra bags for nights when he appeared at my door looking lost and sleepless. I learned to read his moods and how he arranged sheet music, whether he played guitar with the door open or closed. Beneath this ordinary intimacy, something was stirring, something that lived in spaces between friendship and territory I had never learned to navigate. I could feel it building like pressure behind a dam, inevitable and terrifying and impossible to ignore forever. It was a Thursday evening in late October when everything began to accelerate. I was sitting on my bed with a copy of Wuthering Heights, trying to parse the violence of Heathcliff's love, when Elias appeared in the doorway with that particular energy he carried when he had made a decision about something. He said there was a gathering that night. Nothing big, just some friends from his music theory class getting together at an apartment off campus. He described it casually, like it was barely worth mentioning, but something in his posture suggested it mattered more than he was letting on. I told him I had reading to finish, which was true, but not the real reason. The real reason was that I had spent 18 years perfecting the art of avoiding situations where I might be seen too clearly, might be asked questions I did not know how to answer. Parties, even small ones, felt like stages where everyone knew their lines except me. But Elias sat down on the edge of my bed, close enough that I could smell his shampoo, and said he would rather not go alone. He said it like it was no big deal, like he was asking me to walk with him to the cafeteria, but his eyes held something I had learned to recognize, a kind of quiet hope that he was trying not to show too obviously. So I found myself closing Wuthering Heights and reaching for my jacket, following him out into the October evening that tasted like wood smoke and approaching winter. The apartment was a 10-minute walk across campus, through streets lined with houses where warm lights spilled from windows and the sound of voices and music drifted into the darkness. The gathering was exactly what he had promised. Small, maybe 15 people clustered in a living room furnished with mismatched couches and coffee tables made from wooden crates. Someone had strung Christmas lights around the windows even though it was still autumn, casting everything in a soft golden glow that made faces look younger, more hopeful. I did what I always did in these situations. I found a corner, positioned myself where I could observe without being observed, nursed a beer that grew warm in my hands while conversations flowed around me like water around a stone. I was good at being invisible, at taking up just enough space to avoid seeming antisocial while remaining fundamentally unnoticed. But Elias moved through the room like he was made of light itself. He had a guitar in his hands within minutes, was sitting cross-legged on the floor leading an impromptu sing-along to songs I half remembered from high school. People gravitated toward him the way plants turn toward sunlight, drawn by something warm and essential that seemed to emanate from him without effort. What surprised me was how often his eyes found mine across the room, how he would catch my glance and smile. Not the performative smile he gave everyone else, but something smaller, more private. When someone asked who I was, he introduced me with a kind of pride I did not understand, as if I was someone worth knowing rather than just his quiet roommate who happened to tag along. When he played guitar, he looked directly at me during certain songs, as if the lyrics were meant for my ears specifically. When people laughed at his jokes, he glanced over to see if I was laughing too. When someone offered him another beer, he brought one to me without being asked, appeared at my elbow like he had some internal radar tuned to my location. It felt like being tethered by something invisible, like we were connected by a thread that only we could see. I had never experienced anything like it. This sense of being chosen, of being someone's person in a room full of possibilities. The party wound down around midnight. People began gathering coats, making plans for the weekend, exchanging numbers and promises to hang out soon. Elias and I walked back across campus together, our breath visible in the cold air, our footsteps echoing off empty sidewalks. The silence between us felt different than usual, heavier, full of things neither of us was saying. I could feel him looking at me as we walked, could sense some internal debate happening behind his eyes. When we passed under a streetlight, I caught his expression, thoughtful, uncertain, like someone standing at the edge of a cliff trying to decide whether to jump. Finally, when we were halfway across the quad, he spoke. He said he hated coming home to a bed that felt empty. Said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather, but I heard the tremor underneath. The same tremor that had been in his voice that first night when he confessed his loneliness to the darkness. I did not know how to respond, so I said nothing. But something in my chest recognized something in his words, the same hollow ache I carried everywhere, the same hunger for warmth and connection that I had never learned to name properly. When we reached our dorm, we moved through our nighttime routines with unusual care, brushing teeth, changing clothes, turning off lights. I climbed into my bed and lay still, listening to him settle into his own across the room. The radiator clicked and hummed. Outside, wind moved through bare branches. This time, I was not surprised when I heard his feet touch the cold floor. Was not surprised when the mattress dipped as he climbed in beside me. It felt both inevitable and impossible, like something we had been building toward without realizing it. We settled back to back, our shoulders touching through thin cotton t-shirts. His warmth seeped through the fabric, and I could feel his spine against mine, could feel him breathing. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. But something had shifted, some fundamental alteration in the geography between us that could not be undone. I lay awake for a long time, hyper-aware of every point where our bodies connected, every shared breath, every small adjustment that pressed us closer together. I thought about the way he had looked at me across the room earlier, about the invisible thread that had seemed to connect us all evening, about the tremor in his voice when he admitted his loneliness. Something was happening between us, something that lived in the spaces between friendship and whatever came after, something that felt dangerous and necessary and completely beyond my experience. I did not know what to call it, did not know what it would become, but I could feel it growing stronger with each shared breath, each moment of contact in the darkness. We had crossed a line we could not uncross, had entered territory that had no map and no clear destination. All I knew was that lying there with him, back to back in the narrow space of my single bed, felt more like home than anywhere I had ever been. After that night, our routines shifted like tectonic plates, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Days blurred into each other in ways they never had before, measured not by classes or assignments, but by the rhythm of our shared spaces, our careful dance around what neither of us was ready to name. Some nights, Elias would slip into my bed without a word, appearing beside me like a ghost made solid. Other nights, he would stay in his own, and I would lie awake listening to him breathe across the narrow distance, wondering if he was listening to me too. The air between us felt charged, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes when every hair on your body stands at attention. I began to notice things about him that I had never seen before, or perhaps had seen but not allowed myself to catalog. The way he ran his fingers through his hair when he was concentrating, leaving it sticking up at odd angles. The small scar on his left hand that he had gotten from a broken guitar string when he was 16. The way he hummed unconsciously when he was happy, melodies I did not recognize but somehow felt I had always known. He had a habit of biting his lower lip when he was nervous, and I found myself watching for it, using it as a barometer for his internal weather. When professors called on him in class, when he was about to perform a piece for music theory, when he was deciding whether to cross the room to my bed in the darkness. Always, that same small gesture that made him seem younger, more vulnerable than his easy confidence usually suggested. We began to share pieces of ourselves in fragments, like archaeologists trading pottery shards, each revelation small but significant. These conversations happened in the spaces between other things, walking back from dinner, during commercial breaks of late-night television, in the few minutes before sleep claimed us. It was during one of these in-between moments that he told me about Sarah. We were sitting on my bed, backs against the wall, sharing a bag of pretzels while some forgettable movie played on his laptop. He mentioned her casually, like she was a character in a book he had read once and mostly forgotten. They had dated for 2 years in high school, he said. She had been everything his parents wanted for him. Smart, pretty, from a good family that went to the same church on Sundays. She played piano, wanted to be a teacher, baked cookies for school fundraisers. Perfect on paper, he said, like a resume for the kind of life everyone expected him to want. But something had been missing, some essential connection that he could never name or fix. He said it was like trying to love someone through glass, seeing all the right things, but never feeling them properly. When she broke up with him 3 weeks before graduation, citing his emotional unavailability, he had felt relief mixed with guilt. Relief that he would not have to keep pretending, guilt that pretending had been necessary in the first place. He told me this while staring at the laptop screen, but I could feel the weight of his attention, the way he was monitoring my reaction in his peripheral vision. I did not know what he was looking for, what response would be right or wrong. So I simply listened and tried to understand why he was trusting me with this particular piece of his history. When he finished talking, the silence stretched between us like a question neither of us knew how to ask. Finally, he turned to look at me directly and asked if I had ever been in love. The question hit me like cold water. I felt my face flush, felt something twist uncomfortably in my chest. I told him no, which was true but felt inadequate. He waited, clearly expecting more, so I heard myself admitting something I had never said out loud before. I told him I had never really been close to anyone, not romantically, but in any meaningful way, that I had always felt like I was watching life happen to other people, like I was reading a book about experiences I would never have myself. That friendship, real friendship, was as foreign to me as love, maybe more so because at least love was supposed to be mysterious and complicated. I told him I had spent most of my life feeling like I was speaking a language everyone else understood, but I had never quite learned. That social connections seemed to require some instinct I had been born without, some natural ability to read signals and respond appropriately that everyone else took for granted. As I spoke, I realized I was telling him things I had never told anyone, barely even admitted to myself. The words came out clumsy and half-formed, but he listened with the kind of attention that made me feel like they mattered, like I mattered in a way I was not used to. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that changed the entire landscape of our friendship. He said that with me, none of that stuff felt complicated. That talking to me was like breathing, natural and necessary, and something he did not have to think about. That he had never felt as comfortable with anyone as he did lying in this narrow bed, sharing pretzels and confessions in the blue light of a laptop screen. The relief that flooded through me was so intense, it was almost painful. Like a muscle I had been holding tense for 18 years, finally learning how to relax. I felt seen in a way that should have been terrifying, but instead felt like coming home to a place I had never been, but somehow recognized. Our friendship deepened after that conversation, though neither of us tried to name what it was becoming or where it might be heading. We developed new intimacies, small rituals that belonged only to us. He would appear at my shoulder while I was reading, not asking what the book was about, but simply existing in my space until I felt comfortable enough to tell him anyway. I learned that he liked his coffee with too much sugar and not enough cream, that he practiced guitar scales when he was anxious, that he could not fall asleep if there was any light coming under the door. He learned that I read poetry when I was overwhelmed, that I preferred showers late at night when the dorm was quiet, that I had memorized the phone number to home but rarely used it because I never knew what to say. We watched movies together, his laptop balanced between us on the narrow bed, our shoulders and thighs pressed together out of necessity but maintained out of choice even when we could have moved apart. Sometimes he would fall asleep halfway through, his head gradually tilting until it came to rest against my shoulder. The first time it happened, during some late-night screening of a film I cannot even remember now. I sat perfectly still for 2 hours, afraid to breathe too deeply or shift too much and wake him. I memorized the weight of his head against my collarbone, the way his hair smelled like shampoo, and sleep, the soft sound of his breathing against my neck. When the credits finally rolled, I gently shook his shoulder and he woke up slowly, disoriented and apologetic. But the next week, when we settled in to watch something else, he positioned himself a little closer, and when drowsiness overtook him again, he let his head find the same spot on my shoulder with what felt like intention rather than accident. I began to look forward to these moments with an intensity that scared me. The weight of him against me, trusting and warm and completely unguarded, felt like a privilege I had not earned but desperately wanted to keep. I would lie awake afterward, replaying the feeling of his breathing against my skin, wondering what it meant that he chose to be vulnerable with me in ways he was not with anyone else. The danger of it was becoming impossible to ignore. Not external danger, but the internal kind that comes from wanting something so much it threatens to reshape everything you thought you knew about yourself. I was falling into something I had no name for, something that lived in the spaces between friendship and territory I had never been brave enough to explore. But alongside the fear was a relief so profound it felt like a religious experience. The relief of being known, of being chosen, of having someone cross the careful distances I had built around myself and decide I was worth the effort. The relief of breathing differently after years of shallow air, of sleeping next to someone who made the darkness feel less absolute. I did not know what we were building between us, but I could feel its foundation growing stronger with each shared confession, each moment of contact, each night he chose my bed over his own. It was becoming something that could not be taken back or explained away, something that would require decisions and courage and words neither of us had learned to say yet. But for now, in the quiet hours when he lay sleeping against my shoulder and I counted the rhythm of his breathing, it was enough to simply exist in the space we had created together, fragile and unnamed and more real than anything I had ever experienced. It happened on a Tuesday night in November, when the first real snow was falling outside our window and the radiator was working overtime to keep our small room warm. We had been living in this careful dance for weeks, this intricate choreography of shared spaces and unspoken understandings, when suddenly the ground beneath us shifted without warning. I was lying on my back, reading Sylvia Plath from my contemporary poetry class, when Elias appeared in the doorway returning from his evening music practice. His hair was damp from snow, cheeks flushed from the cold, guitar case slung over his shoulder like he was carrying the weight of all the songs he had played that evening. He set down his case with unusual care, moved through his nighttime routine with a deliberate slowness that made me look up from my book. There was something different in his energy, a kind of restless purpose that I had learned to recognize as the prelude to one of our late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. But instead of settling into his own bed as he usually did when he wanted to talk, he came directly to mine, sitting on the edge with a casualness that felt practiced, inevitable. He asked what I was reading, and I showed him the Plath collection, explained the assignment about confessional poetry and the way certain writers made their private pain into public art. He nodded, but I could tell his attention was elsewhere, focused on some internal calculation he was working through. We talked about poetry for a few minutes, about professors and upcoming finals, and whether the cafeteria would ever serve anything that resembled actual food. Safe topics, comfortable ground that we had covered before. Then, in the middle of a sentence about his music theory final, he stopped talking. Just stopped, like he had run into a wall made of his own thoughts. The silence stretched between us, thick with something I could not identify, but felt in my chest like pressure building before a storm. Finally, he spoke, and his words came out in a rush, like he had been holding them back for so long they escaped of their own accord. He said, almost laughing at himself as he said it, that I should know he did not climb into anyone else's bed, that this thing we did, this sharing of space and warmth in quiet hours, was not something he had ever done before, not something he did casually or without thought. The words hung in the air between us like a confession and a question combined. His eyes searched my face, looking for something I was not sure I knew how to give him. I felt my throat constrict, felt heat rise in my cheeks as the full weight of what he was saying settled into my bones. I stammered something inadequate in response, some combination of surprise and deflection that did not answer the real question he was asking. Something about how I had not thought about it that way, how I had assumed it was just comfort, just two people helping each other sleep better in beds that were too narrow and rooms that were too quiet. But even as I said it, I knew it was not true. I had thought about it, had cataloged every moment of contact, had memorized the weight of him against my shoulder and the sound of his breathing in the darkness. I had been thinking about it constantly, obsessively, in ways that made my chest tight and my thoughts scatter like leaves in wind. Elias nodded when I finished stumbling through my non-answer, but something in his expression suggested he had heard the truth beneath my evasions. He did not press, did not ask me to elaborate or admit to things I was not ready to say out loud. Instead, he simply accepted my deflection with the same grace he brought to everything else, and we moved on to safer topics. But the moment had created a crack in the foundation of our careful friendship, a fissure that let in light and air and the possibility of something neither of us had been brave enough to name before. Later, when we had turned off the lights and settled into our respective beds, I lay awake listening to him breathe across the narrow space that divided our lives. I could tell from the rhythm that he was not sleeping either, that he was as wired and unsettled as I was by what had passed between us. When he finally moved, crossing the cold linoleum floor to climb into my bed, it felt different than all the times before. More deliberate, more fraught with meaning and consequence. We settled side by side this time instead of back to back, both of us staring at the ceiling, both hyper-aware of every point where our bodies almost touched. The silence stretched between us, but it was not the comfortable quiet we had grown used to. This was the silence of two people standing at the edge of a cliff, measuring the distance to the ground below and wondering if they had the courage to jump. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, I felt his hand moving across the narrow space between us. His fingers brushed against mine, tentative and warm, asking a question without words. For a moment, I froze, caught between the instinct to pull away and the deeper desire to move closer. But then his fingers curled around mine, gentle but certain, and something inside my chest unlocked. His hand was warm and slightly calloused from guitar strings, and the weight of it against mine felt like an anchor and a revelation combined. We lay there in the darkness, hands intertwined, neither of us speaking or moving beyond the small adjustments needed to maintain contact. But in that simple gesture, everything changed. What had been unspoken became undeniable. What had been careful became inevitable. I realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating that this was not simply comfort we were sharing, not simply the friendship of two lonely people finding solace in proximity. This was something else entirely, something raw and unfinished and more honest than anything I had ever experienced. It was love, though I had no context for understanding what that word meant when applied to this situation. To us, to the impossible geography of two boys sharing a narrow bed in a dorm room where the walls were too thin and the future was too uncertain. I was terrified. Terrified of being seen so completely, of having my carefully constructed defenses dismantled by someone who had learned to read the language of my silences. Terrified of admitting to wants and needs I barely understood, of losing the fragile safety we had built even as we reached for something deeper and more dangerous. But alongside the fear was a relief so profound it felt like drowning and surfacing at the same time. Because when I turned to look at him in the dim light filtering through our window, I saw my own terror and relief reflected in his eyes. The same uncertainty, the same desperate hope, the same recognition that we had stumbled into territory neither of us had mapped, but both of us wanted to explore. We fell asleep like that, hands linked in the darkness, breathing in rhythm. Two people who had finally found the courage to acknowledge what had been building between us for months. When I woke the next morning, he was already gone, slipped back to his own bed sometime before dawn, but the memory of his hand in mine lingered like a promise neither of us was ready to make, but both of us were beginning to believe in. The weeks that followed our first night, holding hands, felt like living inside a held breath. Everything was the same and everything was different, as if someone had adjusted the color saturation of our daily life by just a few degrees, enough to notice but not enough to name. We did not speak of what had happened, but it lived between us like a shared secret, affecting the weight of every glance, every accidental touch, every moment when we found ourselves alone together. The careful architecture of our friendship had shifted, and we were both trying to navigate the new geography without admitting how fundamentally the landscape had changed. Then December arrived with its burden of finals and phone calls home, and the pressure I had been holding at bay for months began to build like steam in a closed container. It was during one of my Tuesday calls with my mother that the world tilted sideways. I had answered expecting the usual routine of weather reports and neighborhood gossip, but instead found myself listening to a conversation I was not meant to hear. My mother had not hung up properly, and I could hear her talking to my father in the background, their voices carrying clearly through the phone. She was telling him about Mrs. Henderson's daughter, how she was home from college for the holidays, and asking after me. A lovely girl, she said, studying to be a nurse, from such a good family. Maybe they could arrange something over Christmas break, a casual meeting, nothing too formal. My father agreed, said it was time I started thinking about settling down, about finding a nice girl who could help me build the kind of life they had always envisioned for me. I sat there listening to them plan my future with someone I had never met, feeling something cold and sharp lodge itself behind my ribs. They spoke about me like I was a puzzle they were trying to solve, a problem that could be fixed with the right combination of circumstances and expectations. When my mother finally realized I was still on the line and returned to the phone, I managed to make appropriate sounds, agreed to consider meeting this girl when I came home, promised to think about what I wanted to do with my life after graduation. But inside, I felt like I was drowning in the weight of their love and their certainty about who I should become. The conversation haunted me for days, replaying in my mind during lectures and meals and the quiet hours before sleep. I began to see my relationship with Elias through the lens of that overheard discussion, began to understand how impossible it would be to explain to anyone back home, how foreign it would seem to people who measured love by its ability to produce grandchildren and suburban houses with white picket fences. Meanwhile, Elias had begun spending time with someone new. Her name was Rachel, and she was in his advanced music theory class, a pretty sophomore with long dark hair and the kind of easy laugh that carries across crowded rooms. I first noticed her when she started appearing at our cafeteria table, sliding in beside him with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Elias had always been social, had always attracted people who wanted to orbit around his particular warmth and charm. But as the days passed, I watched the way her hand would rest on his arm when she laughed, the way he would lean in to hear her better when she spoke, the way they would walk across campus together after music classes, their heads bent close in conversation. The rational part of my mind understood that this was normal, expected even. Elias was attractive and charming and exactly the kind of person who would have no trouble finding romantic connections. What we shared in the quiet darkness of our dorm room existed in a separate sphere from his daytime life, and there was no reason those worlds should not overlap. But watching him with Rachel felt like swallowing glass. Every shared glance between them, every moment when her presence claimed his attention, reminded me of how fragile and unnamed our own connection was. She could touch his arm in public, could claim his time and attention without explanation or apology. She had a word for what she wanted from him, a socially acceptable framework for pursuing it. I had nothing but stolen moments and the memory of his hand in mine in the darkness. The cruelest part was that he still came to my bed at night. After spending his evenings with Rachel, after walking her back to her dorm and saying whatever goodbyes they shared, he would return to our room and cross the familiar distance between his bed and mine. We would lie together in the darkness, hands linked, breathing in rhythm. But now there was a new tension in the silence between us. I wanted to ask him about her, wanted to understand what she meant to him and what that meant for us, but I could not find words that did not sound like accusations or demands. Instead, I lay awake listening to him sleep, wondering if he thought about her while he held my hand, if I was just a convenient source of comfort until something real and recognizable took my place. The breaking point came 3 weeks into December, during one of those brittle winter nights when the air outside was so cold it seemed to crack like glass. Elias had spent the evening at some music department gathering, and I had waited up reading, though I could not focus on the words in front of me. When he finally returned, moving through our nighttime routine with distracted efficiency, I felt something inside me reach its limit. The careful equilibrium we had maintained for months suddenly felt unsustainable, impossible to continue without some kind of resolution or rupture. After we had turned off the lights and he had crossed to my bed as he always did, after we had settled into our familiar positions with hands linked in the darkness, I finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning inside me for weeks. I asked him what this meant. The nights, the closeness, the hand he would not let go of even when everything else about our situation remained undefined and unspoken. I asked him what we were doing and whether it meant anything beyond convenience and comfort. The words came out rougher than I had intended, carrying more weight and desperation than I wanted to reveal. But once I had started speaking, I could not stop. I told him about the phone call home, about the nice girl my parents wanted me to meet, about the future they had planned that left no room for whatever this was between us. I told him about watching him with Rachel, about the particular kind of pain that came from being invisible, from loving someone who could never acknowledge that love in daylight. I told him I was drowning in the uncertainty, in not knowing whether I mattered to him or was simply filling a temporary need until something better came along. When I finished talking, the silence that followed felt enormous, like standing in a cathedral and hearing your voice echo off walls too high to see. I could feel Elias thinking beside me, could sense the weight of everything I had just confessed settling into his bones. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was smaller than I had ever heard it, uncertain in ways that made him sound years younger than 18. He said he did not know what it meant, not exactly, not in terms that anyone else would understand or approve of. But he knew that with me, he felt less alone, more like himself than he had ever felt with anyone else. He told me about the pressure he felt to be a certain kind of person, to want certain kinds of things, to fit into expectations that had never quite made sense to him. He said that lying next to me in the darkness was the only time he felt like he could stop performing, could stop pretending to be someone he was not sure he actually was. He told me Rachel was nice, was exactly the kind of girl he was supposed to want, but that being with her felt like wearing clothes that did not quite fit. That he spent their time together thinking about coming back to this room, to this bed, to the particular kind of peace he found only with me. It was not a declaration of love, not a promise of any kind of future, but it was honest in a way that cut through months of careful avoidance and polite deflection. It was the closest either of us had come to naming what lived between us, to acknowledging that this was not simply friendship or convenience, but something deeper and more dangerous and more necessary. When he finished speaking, I understood that the choice was not between love and nothing, between certainty and emptiness. The choice was between silence and courage, between keeping this fragile thing hidden and letting it exist in whatever limited way it could. I chose to let the truth live, however fragile, however uncertain, however impossible it might seem to the people who thought they knew what my life should look like. I chose him, chose us, chose the terrifying possibility that love did not always come in the packages we expected or the forms we had been taught to recognize. We fell asleep that night still holding hands, but something had shifted between us. We had spoken the truth, or as much of it as we could manage, and the world had not ended. We were still here, still breathing, still choosing each other in the darkness despite everything that made that choice complicated and uncertain. It was not a solution, but it was a beginning. January arrived with the kind of cold that turns breath into clouds and makes every surface sharp to the touch. The campus had emptied over winter break, then slowly filled again with students carrying suitcases and stories from home. But our room had remained constant, unchanged, a small pocket of continuity in the shifting landscape of a new semester. I had gone home for Christmas, spent 2 weeks sleeping in my childhood bedroom with its familiar shadows and unfamiliar distance. My parents had arranged the meeting with Mrs. Henderson's daughter, just as they had planned. We sat in their living room drinking coffee and making conversation that felt like reading lines from a script neither of us had chosen. She was lovely, exactly as my mother had promised, kind and intelligent and studying to be a nurse, full of plans for helping people and building a life that made sense to everyone who looked at it. But sitting across from her, answering questions about my major and my plans after graduation, I felt like I was watching myself from a great distance, like I was performing the role of someone I might have been in a different life. When I returned to campus in early January, Elias was already there, having cut his own holiday short. I found him in our room surrounded by new sheet music, his guitar in his hands, playing something soft and complex that I had never heard before. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and his smile carried a kind of relief that matched what I felt in my own chest. We did not talk about our respective breaks, did not compare stories or analyze what our time away had meant. Instead, we fell back into our rhythms like swimmers returning to familiar water, finding our stroke without conscious thought. The nights resumed their careful pattern. Some evenings he would stay in his own bed. Other nights he would cross the narrow space to mine. But something had shifted during our weeks apart. Some internal recalibration that made the uncertainty feel less like drowning and more like floating, learning to trust the current rather than fighting against it. Rachel appeared less frequently at our cafeteria table. When I asked Elias about it, carefully casual, he said they had decided to be friends, that they wanted different things, and it seemed kinder to acknowledge that sooner rather than later. He said it like it was no big deal, but I caught the way his eyes sought mine when he spoke, looking for something I was learning to give him without reservation. It was on a Tuesday morning in late January that I woke to find myself studying the particular quality of winter sunlight as it crept across our dorm room floor. Elias was still asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even, one hand loosely entangled with mine beneath the covers. His hair was disheveled from sleep, falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable than he appeared in daylight hours. I lay there without moving, afraid to disturb the stillness of the moment, watching light touch the accumulated artifacts of our shared life. The stack of books on my desk, poetry collections mixed with his music theory texts, the photographs taped to the wall above his bed, his family, friends from home, a few of us together taken by someone at a party I barely remembered attending. His guitar leaned against the wall where it always did, and I could see the small notebook where he wrote down lyrics and chord progressions, fragments of songs that might someday become complete. My own notebooks lay scattered across the small space we shared, filled with essays about writers who had learned to make art from the raw materials of their own confusion and longing. The radiator clicked and hummed its familiar morning song. Outside, I could hear the distant sounds of campus waking up, footsteps in hallways, doors closing, the ordinary symphony of people beginning their days. But inside our room, time felt suspended, like we existed in a pocket of stillness separate from the world's relentless forward motion. I thought about the conversation we had shared in December, about the fragile honesty we had managed to build between us. It was not a declaration, not a promise of any particular future. We had not solved the fundamental questions that surrounded us. What we were, what we meant to each other, how this fragile thing we had built could survive in a world that had no clear place for it. But lying there in the early morning light, listening to Elias breathe beside me, I realized that maybe those questions did not need immediate answers. Maybe it was enough to have this moment, this particular configuration of sunlight and warmth and shared breath that felt more like home than anywhere I had ever lived. For the first time in my life, I was not planning 3 steps ahead, not constructing elaborate defenses against uncertainty and loss. I was not cataloging all the ways this could end badly, not preparing speeches to explain myself to people who might never understand. I was simply here, present in my own skin, allowing myself to rest inside a moment that might not last forever, but was undeniably real. Elias stirred beside me, his grip on my hand tightening briefly before relaxing again. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then finding mine in the dim light. He smiled without fully waking up, the kind of unconscious response that happens when someone feels safe enough to be completely unguarded. I smiled back, feeling something settle in my chest that I had never experienced before. Not the desperate relief of being chosen, not the anxiety of potentially being abandoned, but something quieter and more sustainable. The simple recognition that I was exactly where I belonged, with exactly the person I was meant to be beside. It was not a love story in any conventional sense, not the kind of romance that would translate easily to dinner party anecdotes or family gatherings. It was something smaller and larger than that, something that lived in the spaces between words and the moments between breaths. It was enough. For now, in this room with its thin walls and uncertain future, with sunlight painting patterns on the floor and another person's warmth beside me in the narrow bed, it was enough. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to sink back into sleep, knowing that when I woke again, he would still be there. Not forever, perhaps, but for now. And for the first time in my life, now felt like a miracle worth believing in.